She called me controlling, said I made her feel like she was in a prison, all because I asked her, once, where she'd left my car. That was 6 years ago. I was 62, old enough to know better, people would say. And they'd be right. But the heart doesn't check your birth certificate before it decides to trust someone. Her name was Lena Marsh. She came into my life the way a lot of trouble does, quietly, and with a very good reason for everything. I'd been a widower for 3 years when we met. My wife Margaret had passed from a stroke in the winter of 2018. Quick and without warning. The way the worst things tend to happen. We'd been married 31 years. Raised 2 kids in our house in Tauranga, watched them grow up and move away, my son to Christchurch, my daughter to Brisbane. After Margaret died, the house felt less like a home and more like a museum of things I didn't know what to do with. My mate Derek kept telling me to get out more. Come to the quiz night. Come to the RSA dinner. Stop sitting in that bloody house watching the news and going to bed at 8. So I went. And at one of those dinners, a fundraiser for the local bowls club, of all things I sat at a table with a woman named Lena Marsh. She was 54. Smart, funny, asked good questions, laughed at the right moments. She had this way of giving you her full attention when you talked, like what you were saying actually mattered. I wasn't used to that. After 31 years of marriage, you can forget what it feels like to be listened to like that. We started seeing each other. Slowly at first, coffees, a few dinners, a drive up to the Coromandel one weekend. She was between flats, she said. Her previous landlord had sold up and she'd had to move out suddenly. She was staying with a friend, but it wasn't ideal. I didn't push for details. I told myself I was being respectful of her privacy. Looking back, I was just afraid that if I asked too many questions, she'd think I was too much and leave. That fear cost me more than I'd like to admit. Somewhere around the 3-month mark, she mentioned she was struggling to find a decent flat on her own. Everything in Tauranga was expensive, she said. And she didn't want a flat with strangers at her age. It made sense. I understood. And my house had 2 empty bedrooms. So I said, almost without thinking, why don't you stay here for a while? Until you sort something out. She moved in on a Saturday with 3 carloads of stuff. She never sorted something out. At first it was good. There's no point in me pretending otherwise. It was good to have someone in the house again. To cook for 2 people. To hear another voice in the kitchen in the morning. She paid a small amount toward the power bill, $200 a month, which she said was what she could manage until she got back on her feet. I paid the mortgage, the rates, the insurance, the groceries, the internet, all the utilities beyond that $200. I didn't track it at the time. I should have. I didn't. She drove my car too. She'd sold hers before she moved in. Something about it needing repairs she couldn't afford. So she'd take mine to her part-time job at a travel agency in the CBD, and I'd walk or get a lift from Derek if I needed to go anywhere. My car. My legs. Her convenience. I was retired. So I told myself it didn't matter much. I had a decent super and a bit in savings from when I'd sold my plumbing business. I wasn't struggling, but there's a difference between not struggling and being taken advantage of. And I was too proud and too lonely to see which side of that line I was standing on. Things started to shift about 8 months in. Not dramatically, just small things. She'd come home later than she said she would, and not mention it. She'd have phone calls she'd take outside, closing the back door behind her. She'd make plans for the weekend without mentioning them to me. And when I'd find out she was going somewhere, I'd ask offhand, just making conversation, "Oh, where are you off to?" And sometimes she'd tell me, and sometimes she'd give me this look. Just a look, like the question itself was an imposition. I didn't say anything for months. I kept talking myself out of it. She's independent. She's not used to answering to anyone. You're not her father. Don't be that person. Then came the night everything broke. It was a Thursday. She'd taken the car to work normal. I'd expected her back by 5:30, which was her usual finish time. By 5:30, she wasn't home. I texted her. Nothing elaborate. Just, "Hey Lena, you right? Running late?" No reply. 7 o'clock. Nothing. I rang her. It went to voicemail. Now, I want to be clear. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't pacing the hall. I was worried the way any reasonable person is worried when someone they live with doesn't come home and doesn't reply to a message. I made myself a cup of tea and watched the news. But by 8, I rang again. Voicemail again. She walked in at 8:45. No explanation. Dropped her bag on the bench, opened the fridge, poured herself a glass of water. I said, gently, I thought, "You didn't reply to my messages." I was a bit worried. She turned around and looked at me the way you look at someone who has deeply misunderstood the situation. I was out with friends. Right. I didn't know where the car was, where you were. The car. She put her glass down. You're worried about the car. I'm worried about you, Lena. And the car? Yes. It's my car. God. She pressed her fingers to her forehead. You know what your problem is? You're suffocating. You want to know where I am every minute of the day? You want to track my movements? You treat this like she gestured at the kitchen, at me, at everything like I owe you some kind of report. I said, very carefully, I sent you 2 messages and called twice. In 3 hours. And that's 2 messages. And 2 calls too many. She went to bed. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the place where she'd set her glass down. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because I was angry, though I was, underneath it all, but because I kept turning the conversation over, looking for the part where I'd gone wrong, where I'd been unreasonable, where I'd been too much. I couldn't find it. The next morning she was pleasant, made toast, asked if I wanted coffee. Didn't mention the night before. I let it sit, because that seemed easier. But something had settled in me. Not rage, something quieter. A kind of clarity. I started paying attention. Over the next few weeks, I noticed things I'd been choosing not to see. She had more going out nights than she had in. She never contributed beyond that 200. She used the car more than I did. She had a group of people she mentioned vaguely friends, colleagues, the girls who I'd never met and knew nothing about. When I'd suggest we do something together, she'd say, sure, maybe next weekend. And next weekend would come, and there'd be a reason. I wasn't unhappy in the way people describe when they say a relationship was terrible. It wasn't terrible. It was just slowly emptying. Like a tank with a small leak you don't notice until one day you look and there's nothing left. My daughter phoned from Brisbane one evening. Heather. She rings every couple of weeks. I didn't mean to tell her everything, but she asked how things were going, and something in her voice made me honest. I told her most of it. There was a long pause, and she said, Dad, you know that's not okay, right? What you just described isn't a relationship. It's a lodging arrangement where you're also providing emotional support for free. I didn't say anything. Has she ever once made you feel like a priority? Heather asked. I thought about it. Really thought about it. No, I said. Not really. Right, she said. And left it there. She didn't push. She knew she didn't need to. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think people assume a man of my age makes these decisions quickly, practically, like flicking a switch. It wasn't like that. It took me a couple more weeks of sitting with it, of watching her take my car and come back when she felt like it, and treat the space I'd made for her as something she'd always been owed. Then one morning she left for work and I sat at the kitchen table and I looked at the $200 a month she contributed, which I'd written on a notepad like a small joke, and I thought, I am 62 years old. My wife is gone. My house is my home, and I have turned it into a place where I feel like a guest. That was the morning I rang my old solicitor, a fellow named Brian Cox who I'd used when I sold my business. I told him my situation, a partner living in my home, contributing minimally, no formal arrangement. He listened, asked a few questions, and told me what my options were. The car first. I hadn't added her to the insurance. It was registered in my name, always had been. He said I could simply reclaim it, park it differently, change my keys if needed. Not illegal. It's my vehicle. The house was mine. The mortgage was mine. She had no financial stake in the property. But because she'd been living there, she was entitled to reasonable notice if I asked her to leave. 30 days in writing, he said. He'd draft a letter if I wanted. I also rang my bank that same afternoon and had a long conversation about my accounts. Nothing she could access, we'd never combined finances, but I wanted to make sure I understood exactly where everything stood. I didn't tell her any of this. I was calm. I went about the next few weeks normally. Polite. Unremarkable. She had no idea. When the letter arrived, delivered through Brian's office, so it was formal and official looking, she brought it to me at the kitchen table, holding it, like it might bite. What is this? It's notice that I'm reclaiming sole use of the property, I said. You have 30 days. She stared at me. You're kicking me out. I'm giving you 30 days notice, yes. You can't. I live here. You live in my house, I said. On my goodwill. And that goodwill has run out. She sat down. For a moment, I thought she was going to cry, and I steeled myself for that. But what she did instead was get angry, told me I was being cruel, that she'd expected better, that at her age it was nearly impossible to find somewhere decent, that I was leaving her with nothing. I said, quietly, Lena, I asked you 2 messages and 2 calls worth of worry, and you told me I was suffocating you. That's not the behavior of someone who respects the person they're living with, and I'm not prepared to keep providing a home for someone who doesn't. She went to her room. I heard her on the phone for a long time. I made dinner, ate it, washed up, and watched the rugby. The car conversation happened the next morning. She came out and said she needed to take it into the CBD to sort out some things. I told her I'd be needing it from now on and that she was welcome to use the bus or call someone. She looked at me like I'd grown another head. She actually said, But I used the car. You've been using the car, I said. That's finished now. The 30 days were not comfortable. She went through phases: cold, then conciliatory, then cold again. Tried once to have a big conversation about us, about what we could work on together. I told her I didn't see a path forward and I wished her well. She moved into a flat in the end, found one quickly enough when she actually had to. Funny how that works. She took her things over the course of a week and a half. On the last day, she stood at the door with her last bag and said, I hope you know what you've thrown away. I thought about that. Then I said, I know exactly what I've kept. The door closed. I stood in my kitchen. It was quiet. Not the empty quiet of after Margaret that was a grief that lived in the walls. This was a different kind of quiet, a cleaner kind. I rang Heather that evening and told her. She went silent for a moment and then said, Oh, thank God, Dad. I heard the relief in her voice, and I was glad I'd done it before she'd had to say anything more. That was 2 years ago now. I still live in the same house in Tauranga. The car is in my driveway. I had some mates over last month for a long lunch in the garden, and Derek said I seemed like myself again in a way he hadn't seen in a while. I didn't quite know what to say to that, so I just passed him another beer. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I have no regrets. I regret the years I wasted with Margaret telling myself I was too busy to slow down. I don't have the same patience for waste anymore. Not of time, not of space. not of goodwill. There's a thing that happens to people of a certain age, and I see it in men especially. Though I don't think it's exclusive to us, where loneliness makes you a very poor judge of what you deserve. You mistake warmth for love. You mistake someone needing you for someone valuing you. And you lower the bar, so gradually you forget where the floor was. If you are living in a situation where you feel like asking a simple question is a transgression, where your own home doesn't quite feel like yours, where someone is taking more from the arrangement than they're putting in, you are not being sensitive. You're not being demanding. You are recognizing something that is true. Trust that. I'm 64 now. I've got my super, my house, my car, my mates, my kids who ring regularly, and my Saturday mornings with no one to account to. That's not a consolation prize. That's a life. Don't give it away to someone who doesn't think it's worth fighting for. And don't wait until you're standing in your own kitchen, feeling like a guest, to decide you deserve better. You deserve better now. You always did. I've been sitting with this story for 2 years now. Long enough to see it clearly. Long enough to stop second-guessing the parts where I wonder if I could have handled things differently. And to recognize that no, I don't think I could have. Not without becoming someone I wouldn't much like. What happened with Lena wasn't dramatic in the way people sometimes expect these things to be. There was no single explosion, no terrible revelation. It was quieter than that. It was the slow erosion of something I'd built over a lifetime. My sense of what I was worth by someone who simply never thought to ask, and I let it happen. Which is the part I've had to sit with most honestly. That's the thing about cause and effect that no one tells you plainly enough when you're in the middle of it. Every time I chose not to say something, every time I talked myself out of asking a reasonable question because I was afraid she'd find me too much, those were choices. Small ones, each of them, but they accumulated. They built the situation as much as anything she did. I handed over the car keys. I signed up for the $200 a month. I made it easy. And then I was surprised when it continued. Tracing it back like that isn't self-punishment. It's just honest accounting. You can't change what you don't understand. And I'd spent too many months refusing to understand it, because understanding it meant having to do something about it. What I've come to think, and I'm 64 now, so I've had time to think about a few things, is that wisdom isn't what you know. It's what you're willing to face about yourself. I knew something was wrong long before Heather asked me that question on the phone. I knew before that night in the kitchen with the glass of water and the look on Lena's face. I knew. I just wasn't willing to face what it meant, because facing it required me to act, and acting required me to risk being alone again. That's the root of it. Fear of going back to that quiet house with no one in it. And I want to say clearly, that fear is completely understandable. Grief does things to you. Loss does things to you. They make you reach for warmth even when the warmth isn't quite real. There's no shame in having done that. The only mistake is staying once you can see it for what it is. Moral courage. And I think that's the right phrase. For it isn't the courage to confront someone else. It's the courage to confront yourself. To say, I deserve more than this. To say it quietly, without drama, and then act accordingly. Brian drafted the letter. I rang the bank. I changed nothing about my voice or my manner. I was just clear. That clarity, I think, is what self-respect actually looks like in practice. Not a speech, not a confrontation, just a decision, made with both eyes open and then followed through. Lena stood at that door on her last day and said she hoped I knew what I'd thrown away. I've thought about that line a fair bit, and I think she genuinely believed it, that she was the thing of value in the arrangement. And I was lucky to have had her. That's not malice. That's just what happens when someone has been allowed, for long enough, to take without accounting. You start to believe that taking is your natural right. Don't let anyone live in that belief at your expense. And don't wait until you're 62 to start believing your own home belongs to you.